woman walked into the throne room of the Persian palace in 479 BC, carrying a piece of clothing. It was a robe, hand-woven silk, ornate and recognizable to everyone who saw it. The moment she wore it, she had made a confession that could not be denied. The king had sworn an oath he could not take back. The queen had witnessed a humiliation she could not ignore. And the machinery of Persian royal power, the same machinery that governed an empire stretching from Egypt to India, was about to be turned inward with a precision that would destroy an entire family and transform a private scandal into an act of state terror. What happened next was not a crime of passion. It was not an impulsive act of jealousy. It was a calculated demonstration of power conducted in plain sight before the assembled court, designed to send a message that would echo through the halls of the palace for the remaining years of a dying reign. A message written not in words, but in blood, carved into a human body, impossible to deny and impossible to forget. But to understand how a king who commanded the largest empire in the world ended up trapped by his own customs, manipulated by a woman he had underestimated, forced to authorize a punishment he did not want and could not prevent, you have to go back further. You have to go back to the moment when that same king stood on a hillside in Greece and watched his entire fleet collapse into the sea. You have to understand what that failure did to him psychologically, how it metastasized through his court, how the need to reclaim authority in the only place he still had absolute power led him to make decisions that would eventually get him murdered in his own bed by the men entrusted to protect him. This is the story of how Xerxes I, King of Kings, brought down his own dynasty from the inside, how pride twisted into obsession, how obsession twisted into brutality, how the court rituals meant to stabilize an empire became the weapons that destabilized it. And most importantly, this is the story of what happens when a king loses the external stage and tries to dominate the internal one instead. In 480 BC, Xerxes I commanded the largest military expedition the ancient world had ever seen. Conservative estimates placed his combined forces at over 200,000 men, more soldiers than most Greek city-states had citizens. He had inherited this campaign from his father Darius I, who had been defeated at Marathon a decade earlier and died before attempting a second invasion. Xerxes was determined to finish what his father had started. He spent 4 years preparing. He ordered a canal dug through Mount Athos so his fleet would not suffer the same catastrophic losses that had wrecked his father's ships. He had pontoon bridges built across the Hellespont. When a storm destroyed the first set, he ordered the water itself, whipped and branded with hot irons. Ancient historians recorded this as madness. It was not. It was theater. Xerxes ruled an empire of dozens of ethnic groups, speaking dozens of languages. His authority depended on perception, on the belief that he operated on a different plane than ordinary men. Punishing the sea was a message to his own army. The king controls even nature itself. His forces crossed into Greece. At Thermopylae, 300 Spartans held a mountain pass for 3 days before being outflanked and destroyed. Xerxes pushed south. Athens was evacuated and burned. For a moment, it appeared that Greece would fall. Then came Salamis. The Greek fleet lured the Persian navy into a narrow strait near Athens. The passage was too tight for Persian ships to maneuver. Vessels collided with each other, Command signals could not reach the outer formations. The Greeks tore the fleet apart. Xerxes had positioned a golden throne on the hillside overlooking the strait. A deliberate choice, so every captain, every oarsman, every marine would know the king was watching, so that their performance was being observed by the man who could elevate or destroy them with a word. Now that same throne forced him to watch as his ships rammed each other, capsized, and burned. When the battle ended, the Greek fleet controlled the strait. The supply line connecting the Persian army to Asia was severed. Without the navy, the land campaign could not be sustained through winter. Xerxes made a decision that would define everything that followed. He left. He did not stay to regroup. He did not attempt to rebuild the fleet. He withdrew from Greece entirely, leaving his general Mardonius behind with roughly 80,000 men to finish what had become an impossible task. That army fought on for another year before being destroyed at Plataea in 479 BC. Xerxes never returned to Greece. He never launched another Western campaign. The man who had crossed the Hellespont with the promise of conquest had returned without it. And that return, that silent withdrawal, that failure to even attempt a second invasion, was the trauma that would reshape everything that followed. The retreat itself, the silence after it, the 14 years of inward withdrawal. That is where this story actually begins. Xerxes was not deposed. The Persian Empire remained the largest political entity on earth, stretching from Libya to the Indus Valley. But empires do not run on territory. They run on perception. Xerxes had crossed the Hellespont with an explicit promise of conquest. He returned without it. In a court system where the king's authority was tied to divine favor, where the monarch was presented as Ahura Mazda's chosen instrument of truth and order, military failure was not just a setback. It was a theological crisis. No one said this openly. Persian court culture did not permit direct criticism of the king. But the behavioral shifts were visible. Governors consolidated regional power. Tribute payments slowed. The network of royal informants reported increasing independence among provincial administrators. Inside the palace, the change was profound. Xerxes retreated from military campaigns entirely. For the remaining 14 years of his reign, he launched no major operations. He turned instead to construction, to reliefs that emphasized his titles and divine connection. And he turned to the internal life of the court, to the only place where his authority remained absolute. A king who has lost the external stage often tries to reclaim authority on the internal one. For Xerxes, that internal stage was a palace filled with family, servants, and nobles whose positions depended entirely on his favor. One person in particular caught his attention. Xerxes had a brother named Mecystes. Mecystes was not peripheral. He had commanded troops during the Greek campaign and governed Bactria, the strategically critical province covering parts of modern Afghanistan. He was royalty by blood, military by career, politically significant by position. He was also married, and Xerxes wanted his wife. This is recorded directly in Herodotus's histories. Xerxes pursued the wife of Mecystes. She refused. The king of the Persian Empire, the man who controlled the largest army, the largest treasury, the largest administrative network in the world, and this woman whose name Herodotus does not even record, said no. Xerxes did not force the issue, not out of moral hesitation, but out of strategic calculation. Mesistes had troops. He had regional authority. He had the loyalty of one of the most militarily capable provinces in the empire. Forcing the king's will on his wife would be an act of aggression against Mesistes himself. That would create a problem Xerxes could not afford. Not after Greece, not with the court already watching his authority erode. So the king changed strategy. He would not go directly at what he wanted. He would rearrange the board until what he wanted was within reach. The tool he used was marriage. He arranged for his eldest son, Crown Prince Darius, to marry Mesistes' daughter, a woman named Artante. Royal families in the ancient Near East married within themselves routinely. It looked like standard dynastic maintenance. But the purpose was not consolidation. It was proximity. By marrying Artante into the crown prince's household, Xerxes brought Mesistes' entire family closer to the court, closer to the palace, closer to him. But proximity has a way of rearranging intentions. The access Xerxes had engineered produced an outcome he had not planned. His fixation morphed. It shifted from the mother to the daughter, Artante, the woman who had just married his own son. Herodotus does not narrate a seduction. He records the results. Xerxes and Artante began an affair. Why did she agree? The honest answer is we do not know. Herodotus does not give her an interior voice. In a court where a woman's security depended entirely on male favor, proximity to the most powerful man alive was not a sentimental decision. It was a survival calculation. Or she may have desired him, or she may have seen an opportunity. The record does not tell us. What the record tells us is that Xerxes made a promise he could not take back. During one of their encounters, he swore a royal oath to Artante. She could ask for anything, and he would grant it. In the Achaemenid system, royal oaths carried religious authority that could not be violated without undermining the very framework that made the king the king. Xerxes made the oath expecting a manageable request: gold, jewelry, an estate. Artante asked for the robe he was wearing, a specific, identifiable garment hand-woven by Queen Amestris as a personal gift to the king. When Xerxes wore it, it communicated a message visible to everyone. The queen made this for me. We are united. If Artante wore it, every layer of that message inverted, the queen's own creation on another woman's body. Xerxes understood immediately. He tried to undo it. He offered her cities. He offered unlimited gold. Herodotus records that he offered her an army under her personal command. Artante refused everything. She wanted only the robe. There are two possible readings of this moment. The first, Artante was reckless, wanting the most impressive object she could see without calculating the cost. The second, she understood exactly what she was doing. The robe was not a trophy. It was a mechanism. As long as the affair was secret, she was disposable. The moment it became visible, she became a fact the court had to accommodate. Xerxes handed over the robe. Amestris saw it on Artante. She did not scream. She did not confront Xerxes immediately. She did not make demands or threats. She waited. This patience itself was a strategy. Amestris was not simply the king's wife. She was the daughter of Otanes, one of the 7 conspirators who had overthrown the false king Smerdis and placed Darius I on the throne. Her political position was inherited, independent of Xerxes. She had alliances among the old nobility that predated her marriage, connections that went deeper than marital bonds. The queen's power in a Persian court was maintained through a visible understanding, challenging her carried consequences. The moment that understanding collapsed, every ambitious woman, every rival family would begin repositioning themselves, looking for a new patron, sensing weakness in the highest position. Amestris did not see the robe and feel betrayed. She saw the robe and identified a threat to her position that required a calculated response. She made a decision that reveals everything about how power actually functioned in the Persian court. She did not target Artante directly. She targeted Artante's mother, the wife of Masistes. Whether Amestris genuinely believed the mother had orchestrated the affair to elevate their family's position, or whether she simply found it useful to believe, the record cannot tell us. What the record tells us is that she made a calculated choice of target based on maximum impact and visibility. Once a year on the king's birthday, Persian custom required the king to grant any request made during the royal feast. This was embedded in the ritual structure of the monarchy, enforced by both religious authority and political precedent. Refusing such a request before the assembled court would undermine the king's own legitimacy and send a message that his own customs could be violated. Amestris had calculated all of this. She had chosen her timing with the precision of a strategist. During the feast, before nobles, priests, military commanders, and provincial governors, before the entire assembled power structure of the empire, she made her request. She asked for the wife of Masistes to be handed over to her custody. Everyone in that room understood what that meant. Xerxes tried to stop it. He pulled Amestris aside privately, trying to redirect her request and offering alternatives that might satisfy her without requiring him to authorize what he did not want. Amestris held firm. She had chosen her request. She had chosen her timing. She had chosen her audience. Xerxes then left the feast and went to Masistes directly. Without explaining the affair or revealing the queen's plan, he urged his brother to divorce his wife. He even offered his own daughter as a replacement wife for Masistes, trying to remove the target before the weapon could land. Masistes refused. He had no idea what was happening. He loved his wife. He saw no reason to abandon her on the vague, inexplicable urging of a brother who would not give a straight answer. Xerxes had been completely maneuvered. The oath to Artante had stripped his control over the secret. The birthday customs stripped his control over the consequence. He gave consent. He handed the woman over. What followed was systematic physical destruction. Herodotus records that the woman was mutilated, targeted at features that carried social identity and allowed participation in public life. The injuries were designed to be visible, permanent, and inescapable. She was not killed. She was left alive, conscious, and eventually returned through the palace corridors, past the same guards and servants who had seen her walk in whole. This was deliberate and public. The mutilated woman moving through the corridors was a walking message impossible to ignore or deny. The purpose was to install something in the mind of every person who saw her. Every noble woman considering her own ambitions, every rival family weighing its options, every faction looking for weakness. The message was written on a human body. This is what happens to women caught in royal scandals, where the queen perceives a threat to her position. The wife of Masistes had not conducted the affair. She had rejected Xerxes when he approached her. The target was chosen for maximum visibility and impact, not for guilt. Xerxes was a governor. His wife was known throughout the court. Her condition would be seen, discussed, and remembered across every corridor of the palace complex. Her suffering became policy. It became precedent. It became the answer to the question that every person near power was always asking: what will happen to me if I am caught in the machinery of court conflict? When Xerxes saw what had been done to his wife, when he understood that this had been authorized by the king himself as a response to a scandal he had no knowledge of, when he comprehended that he had been caught in machinery he could not see or understand, his response was immediate and absolute. He did not petition the king for mercy or explanation. He did not seek mediation or negotiation. He gathered his sons, gathered his household, and turned east toward Bactria with the intention of raising the province in open revolt against Xerxes himself. His plan was to use his position as governor, his military experience, his regional authority, and the legitimacy of his grievance to assemble a force capable of challenging the throne. For the first time, the private scandal had crossed into imperial security. A governor with royal blood, military credentials, and a legitimate cause for fury was marching toward an army he personally controlled. If he reached Bactria, the situation became civil war, the very thing the Persian court structure was designed to prevent. Xerxes did not negotiate. He sent soldiers. Xerxes and his sons were intercepted on the road before reaching Bactria. They were killed, all of them, an entire branch of the Achaemenid royal family, removed from existence. After the killings, the empire continued to function, but the court had witnessed something that could not be unwitnessed. The king manipulated by his own customs, unable to protect his own family from a punishment he did not sanction, ordering the execution of his own brother over a personal scandal he himself had initiated. For 14 years, that knowledge circulated through the palace. It sat in the back of every conversation. It shaped every calculation. It changed the answer to the question that every person near power was always asking: am I safe? The answer was increasingly no. For 14 years, that answer hardened into certainty. In 465 BC, it finally arrived at its destination. Xerxes was assassinated in his own bedchamber. The man who killed him was Artabanus, commander of the royal bodyguard, the man whose sole function was to keep the king alive while he slept, to guard him in the moment when he was most vulnerable. He was aided by Aspamitres, a court eunuch who controlled physical access to the king's private chambers, who held the keys to those rooms. Consider what that geometry means. The two people with the most intimate access to the king, the man who guarded his door, the man who held its key, had coordinated his death. These were not outsiders. These were not rebels from a distant province plotting in secret. These were the innermost circle, the men who dressed him, who walked beside him, who stood in silence while he slept. They had watched him for years. They had watched the Greek campaign fail and end in humiliation. They had watched the Xerxes affair unfold and the punishments spiral into civil war. They had watched the rituals weaponized and the royal bloodline thinned by the king's own decisions. And at some point, somewhere in the depths of those years of observation, they stopped seeing a king worth protecting. They began seeing a threat. Artante disappears from the record after the robe incident. Her fate is unrecorded. Did she survive? Did she face consequences for the affair? Did she return to her position, or was she exiled? The historical record is silent on all of these questions. The wife of Masistes, the woman who refused a king and was destroyed for someone else's decisions, also disappears. Whether she survived her injuries for years or days, whether she ever recovered mobility or function, whether she lived out her life as a permanent living reminder of the queen's power, Herodotus does not say. What the record does tell us is that after the assassination, after Artabanus's attempt to seize the throne himself and his subsequent execution, the Achaemenid dynasty survived another 130 years before falling to Alexander of Macedon. The empire endured. The administrative machinery that Darius I had built proved robust enough to absorb the internal bleeding of civil war and regicide without collapsing entirely. But the pattern that crystallized during Xerxes' reign, the dangerous pattern of internal destruction and weaponized ritual and loyalty, answered with violence repeated across generations. And that pattern, more than any external enemy, more than any military defeat, more than any economic crisis, was what slowly hollowed out the empire from within until it was vulnerable enough to fall to a young Macedonian conqueror. The people who set the events in motion, Amestris, who weaponized the birthday custom, Artabanus, who orchestrated the assassination, continued to hold power or simply disappeared from history. The people who were caught in the machinery, Artante, the wife of Masistes, all the noble families that learned the lesson through watching these events unfold, did not. That is the record, 2,500 years old. Most textbooks skip this story entirely. Now you know why.